Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. This is the final installment of our winter webinar series. Today is going to be an overview of the Welsh course that is going to be taught at British Institute 2020 in October in Salt Lake City. Our presenter is Darris Williams. Those of you who know Darris know that he is well-versed in Welsh genealogy. I hope everybody is staying safe and staying healthy and keeping your distance from others. And this is a fabulous way for us to be able to pass some of that time. Welcome, Darris.
Thank you.
I will let you go ahead.
All right. Well, there's an awful lot that we can talk about, and hopefully we can do a few questions at the end. What I want to do is give you an idea of a lot of things that are possible with your Welsh family history. And we can't get into the details like we will at British Institute. British Institute's just a fabulous opportunity because you've got 20 hours of classroom instruction. You've got time every day at the family history library with the instructor. And it helps us have the opportunity to actually look a little bit at the details that you need help with and give you the assistance, the personal assistance you need. And so what we struggle with, or what I struggle with on a class like this, is trying to figure out exactly, or what's the best things to share, because there's so much that we could talk about. And I hope we'll get enough that it'll help you even if you can't attend the British Institute. But if you can, this will give you a taste of some of the really neat things that are available for Welsh family history. So my slide doesn't want to, there we go. All right, so I want to start out by outlining some of the benefits or the blessings that we have when we're doing Welsh family history, and then some of the curses, things that are going to throw a wrench in the works and give you difficulty. Usually if you're not aware of the problem, if you're aware of the situation, such as with common names, it's a whole lot easier to deal with, and the same is true with patronymics. So you'll notice if we start by looking at the blessings side of things, one thing that's really helpful with Welsh family history is that you have manuscript pedigrees, many of them recorded before 1800. And I'll share an example of one of those that's impacted my research and how it predates parish registers in the parish where I'm working. Wales probably has more information online for historical records than any other country I'm aware of. When you look at the main record sets or record categories that we normally use for family history, talking about census records, church records, probate records, and civil registration for the British Isles. And census records are online, civil registration, there's really good indexes and then some extra information. Church records, the Church of England records for Wales are almost all online and indexed quite well. And probate records for Wales, unlike any other place in the British Isles, virtually all of the probate records for Wales are available online and for free with the probates. So there's some really good opportunities there, and that's definitely different for Wales than most countries. Nonconformity, in my opinion, is a great blessing because there's so many extra records generated by people that belong to a church or a chapel other than the Church of England. So if your ancestors were Baptists or Methodists or one of the other denominations, there's a fair chance that you'll be able to find additional records that you won't get if your ancestor just belonged to the Church of England. Now, patronymics are a little bit difficult. It's something that's not understood. It's the Welsh naming custom, and That's part of the reason we have so many common names, but I'll show you a few examples of how to understand that and actually benefit from it. Now, the National Library of Wales is another great blessing for Welsh family historians. If you're not familiar with that website, you'll want to get familiar with it. It's one of the greatest resources available for Welsh family history, and it's got so many sources there that you could almost do a week-long course just on the materials at the National Library of Wales. In fact, I attended a course like that once early in my career. It was a week-long course at the National Library of Wales, and it was not enough time, and it was a huge blessing to me because it was coordinated by John and Sheila Rowlands, who are two of the best authors and authorities on Welsh family history. The Welsh probate abstracts, I'll show you an example of that. And if you're working with probate records, there's a lot of value you can get from those, but the probate abstracts actually open that up a lot more. So no other country that I'm aware of has more than just a tiny bit of probate records that have been abstracted in their collections. England has a few, but they're scattered, but it's virtually all done for Wales before 1858. Now, some of the curses, and I'm guessing most of us have run into this, there are a few that don't have common names that are researching in Wales, but most of us will run into this. And I'll show you some things that you can do to work around that problem. Again, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time today for that, but I'll give you a taste of it, and there's a whole lot more that you can do to work around that problem. Late start date of parish records will impact almost all of us. Some of the parish records don't start until the 1700s, and they should be starting in 1538. And so you have to get creative, but there are records that will help with that pre-1700 time period really well. Nonconformity, again, is a blessing and a curse, and part of the reason for that is that some of the chapel's records have not survived very well. But again, I believe in almost every case there's some way to work around the research problem you run into. And so although that can throw a wrench in the works with your research, there are things that you can do that should be able to help you work around some of that at least. Some of the problems you run into patronymics with will be talking about a little bit more. And if you understand it and remember to think about the situation with patronymics as you're doing your searches online or in the original records, then you can turn that curse right around and benefit from it quite a bit. Now, one problem you run into with Welsh family history, and it's similar with Irish family history, but I don't think it's quite as bad. I've heard it said that with researching in Ireland, you have to spend about 75% of your time looking for more records, trying to find the records. And there's a little bit of that involved in Welsh family history, but it's not quite as bad as Ireland. What it does, though, it gives you, as you search for those other records, it gives you a lot more richness to the family history. As you discover more and more about your ancestors, you'll understand the situations they lived in, you'll understand what was happening in the area, and you'll understand your ancestors' lives a whole lot better. So using more records is actually a blessing in disguise because you'll learn so much more and you'll benefit from that extra time involved, that extra work required. So it takes more time, but it is a lot more rewarding in my opinion. In the Welsh language, that can be a little bit of a difficulty. There are ways that you can work around that. I'll show some examples. It's not horrible, and a lot of your research you can do without learning very much, if any, Welsh. But if you learn just a little bit, then it really boosts you and will give you a lot more advantage as you're doing your research. So I've got an example here of one of the early Welsh pedigrees. It's one that was created in 1678. I'll zoom in on this on the next slide so you can read it a little bit better. But this was gathered by an individual, and it was actually published in 1845 in print form. It's not published in this pedigree format, but it's not too hard to put that together. And you'll notice with the first person at the bottom of the screen that it gives his name and a time period and the name of the farm. And we'll talk about the names of the farms more as we get into this. I've got a couple more examples, but just want to point out right here that one of the blessings with doing your Welsh family history is that most individuals were associated with a farm, a place, a nickname, something to help identify them more clearly. Because guess what? Even your ancestors couldn't keep Evan Evans and another Evan Evans straight without some extra information to identify them. So you'll see these farm names included very often, or an occupation, and that's the clue that makes all the difference in the world. It's almost like your ancestor's social security number or identification number that very clearly identifies that individual with a family in a time and place. So it's critical information. As soon as you get that kind of information, then you're off to the races. Kind of opens the door or opens the gate to a lot of opportunities for more research and more searches and more records. So as you follow this tree up, you'll be able to see the names added in and the dates, and look at how early these dates are. This stretches from 1631. Let's go back to the previous slide, and it goes back to 1421 at the very top. And there you've got Evan, Griffith, Ap, Owen, Gethin. So there's 4 generations there in 1421. So this pedigree that was put together in 1678 goes back into the 1300s. Now, one of the first things you should be asking is, how accurate is this? And they have found that these manuscript pedigrees that have been compiled for Wales over the years do have inaccuracies, but in general, they have a high degree of accuracy. There's a lot of good information in here. And it's like any other clue, any other lead that you get, it's just a guide, and you need to substantiate it with other sources. And I've started working on this particular family to document the information here based on sources that are available for the time periods. And even in the 1500s and occasionally in the 1400s, you can find documentation for some of this information. And I've started piecing that together, and it's been very enlightening, very accurate. So this is for a family in the parish where some of my ancestors lived, and it just gives me a degree of hope of being able to find additional sources and tie things together to where I can learn more about my family and the area where they lived. So let's talk about some of the key records that are available online. I've got examples here of some of the major sources, and with most British Isles research, it's considered pretty standard to look at census and church records and civil registration and probate. I've added in with Wales, I always add in monumental inscriptions or tombstone inscriptions because they provide a great value that you need, and you need to add that to your toolbox when you're doing Welsh family history. So to start with, we want to look at census records. It's typically one of the first record types that you should look at because it links individuals together, usually a family, sometimes it's neighbors, but you'll get an individual within the family context. You'll get a place name, a farm name, hopefully, residence, and you'll get an occupation. You should get a birthplace. Anytime before or from 1851, you should get the parish and county of birth. Now, that's pretty critical. 1841, they didn't get as specific with the details. You just see whether they were born in the county or not. So these records are available online from 1841 through 1911, and they're all indexed by name. Some of the websites provide different options for the searches you can do. Family Search, Find My Past, Ancestry, and My Heritage all have these records. One thing that we've found, a lot of people find this, you can do a search on, say, Find My Past and not find the person you're looking for. You can search on Ancestry or Family Search and the person pops right up when you do the search. I've got an example of an ancestor that can't be found on any of the census records except My Heritage, and their indexes pick them up. And the reason is that they have different search algorithms. They have they can consider certain names variants of each other, and those are different from website to website. So one technique that you want to employ, or one tactic you want to use, is if you don't find who you're looking for and you think they should be there, always try the other websites, because there is a fairly good chance that either the index was a little bit off, the name was indexed incorrectly, or their search algorithm works different enough that you'll be able to find it on the next website. Now, in theory, you shouldn't have that problem. If you're looking for Evan Evans, how hard can that be, right? Now, another record, and this doesn't get used often enough, I think, in my opinion, is the civil registration records for England and Wales. Now, there's a free index available at FreeBMD, and these links should all be in the handout. You can do searches on indexes for births and deaths on the second bullet at the GRO website, and you can actually order a PDF version of those certificates and have that delivered by email within 5 working days. So the GRO index adds a little bit of extra information. On the birth indexes, it'll give the mother's maiden name, which can be really helpful if you know what the mother's maiden name is. If you don't, it's worth finding that in one way or another so that you can narrow your searches down. And that's part of what we'll get into at British Institute in the class, where we'll have more time to look at the options with civil registration searches. If you're dealing with common names, knowing the mother's maiden name is really going to make a difference when you're trying to find a birth certificate for one of the kids. And the GRO index makes that a lot easier to incorporate that into your search parameters. The death certificates or death indexes on the GRO website also include the death date or age at death beginning in 1837 when the records begin. So that's an addition that most indexes did not have. It's an enhancement they've created or added in, and it's huge. When you're looking for somebody with a common name, you can narrow things down and utilize that age at death to help decide which Thomas William out of the 10 that could be him is actually yours. And even if you can only narrow it down to 4 possible candidates, that's a whole lot better, and you could order each of those certificates until you get the right one, or order all at once and look at the differences, so that you can decide which one is really yours. But there's different techniques that you can use to narrow those options down. And that's some of what we'll talk about in more detail at British Institute. So let's talk about church and chapel records. This has typically been the place where people would start, and for good reason. With Wales, I think it's probably better if you can start with census records, so you have a broader picture of the family that you're looking at, and then go into church and chapel records. Parish records for the Church of England were supposed to start in 1538. There are some for Wales that start that early, but not a lot. In fact, many don't start until about 1700. So there's quite a deficiency there, but there's still a lot of information available in the records that do survive. And when you get back to that time period, there are other records that can be utilized that can help you continue your searches well into the 1500s in most cases, sometimes 100 years or so earlier than that. So in 1754, they started putting the marriages into a separate book and formatted the pages in a way that required just a little bit more detail than had been recorded before 1754. Starting in 1597, copies of the records were supposed to be sent to the bishop of the diocese at the end of the year. And some of those, a fair number of those start fairly early in Wales, but again, there's a survival issue with the records. And one of the techniques you'll need to use as you're working in your families is to be sure that you're always looking at both the parish register and the bishop's transcript when they exist. And in 1812, they started using a pre-printed form. And this is what you'll see beginning in 1812. It makes it a whole lot easier to read. It does give specific pieces of information that should be filled in before 1812. They may give you some of these details, and in other cases, they may only give you the child's name, the given name of the child, and maybe the father's name. And they may not give the abode, and in most cases, they will not identify the father's occupation. So beginning 1812, the records get a whole lot better for the Church of England in some ways. So one of the things I want to point out is what you see circled in red now. This, again, is the farm name. And like I said before, this is a little bit like a social security number. If you've got the farm name, then you've got detail that clearly identifies which Evan family you're dealing with. And it's a huge differentiator. When I went on one of my earlier trips to Wales to do some research with my dad's first cousin, who had kind of been the family genealogist, we went to the village where my great-grandfather was born and raised, and we were asking around and said we were looking for family from Gesli Lukavauer. And somebody said, "Oh, you need to talk to John Gesli Luka." They still use the farm name to identify individuals and families to a degree. And so when you're actually there, it's still not unreasonable to expect to find people using this system. And it's a great, great blessing for family historians looking at Welsh families. Now, one of the best books you can have access to is Parish Registers of Wales. It gives you details about the parish records that survive, where they're located, the parish registers, so that's births, or christenings, marriages, and burials. It includes information for both the parish registers and the bishop's transcripts. And it's the most complete listing available. Now, there have been just a few missing registers that have been found. So on occasion, and it's very rare, but there are cases where there are extra pieces of information available. And the best thing to do is figure out which county record office has the records, the original records, and if the records you need are not available, then you can contact them. But this book will help you identify what records are known to survive, where the gaps are, and the county record office contact for more details if necessary. Now, virtually all of the parish registers for Wales should be online, but when they digitized those records, there were 56 parishes that said, we don't want you to digitize our records. Now, Find My Past was involved with this, with Family Search, in making this available online, and they've been working to get permission to add some of those additional parishes. There's still a little bit of work to do to make sure that all of the parish records are available online. So the key here is, if you're not finding what you expect or what you think you should be finding, you need to make sure that you're looking to see what else is available out there. And that's where the Parish Registers of Wales can be a starting point that gives you the contact archive where you can start asking questions, or if there's some information on the Family Search Wiki about that. Now let's talk about nonconformity. With Wales in 1851, about 75% of the population belonged to a nonconformist chapel. So Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist. And one of the things you'll see with the nonconformist records is they'll often give a lot more information or detail than what the Church of England register would at the same time period. At this time period in the 1760s, you'd typically get the child's name and maybe the father's name in the christening record. But here you get John, the first child of Thomas William Rutherick Jr. And it gives a birth date sometimes and the christening date. So on the bottom entry, we've got Hannah, the child of Thomas Howell of Gaffiluca. So these records for this particular chapel provide some of the extra detail that you wouldn't get in a Church of England record. Almost never see that there. Now, with nonconformists, one issue you'll run into is that they would travel sometimes a fair distance to have their child christened or to listen to a specific minister, preacher. And what this slide illustrates is how far people would travel, or where people traveled from to attend a specific chapel. And where the blue star is located is where the chapel was, in Abergwili in Carmarthenshire. And each red dot represents a christening of a child in that chapel. It identified where the family resided. So you can see that if you had a family from New Church, for instance, just to the left of Abergwili, if you only searched in New Church for the christening of your ancestor, you have a very good chance of missing the information you're looking for, because it would have been recorded and kept with records associated with Abergwili. Now, as bad as this looks, it actually gets worse. So you should be seeing some additional red dots coming in to other parishes. So you can see that sometimes they traveled from a little bit further out, and you don't know how far out they're going to come from. You normally would consider the adjacent parishes first, and this slide illustrates that pretty well, that the adjacent parishes, except for the ones to the south, actually were the ones where most people were coming from. So if you're researching for your ancestor in New Church, for instance, you would want to search the adjacent parishes, and if you don't find them in the christening records at New Church. And this is typical of all of the nonconformist chapel records that I've ever used. This just illustrates it really nice, and at British Institute we'll get into more details on some of the things you can learn from these chapel records. So monumental inscriptions are one of my favorite records. I don't think they are used often enough. You can get some on Find My Past. The Family History Library has gathered a lot of these that have been recorded. Local family history societies have worked hard to document these, but there's still a lot that they haven't done. The Church of England Parish Church, where this particular stone was found, those have not been published by the local family history society yet. And so you may have to do a little bit of searching, but one of the things that you can expect to get is on average about 3 people named per stone. And you want to look for these no matter what else you're doing. This is one of the sources that helps tie individuals together. And you don't get that as much as you would like from other record types. So census, probate are really good for this, and probably right next to those two are the monumental inscriptions. Now, I want to compare on this slide. If you look at the bottom, that's the burial register for this church. And I found the burial record for Margaret, the wife of Samuel Llewellyn. In the parish register, it just gives the date that she was buried. But you'll notice on the tombstone, it gives her age. And that's so critical. What I couldn't show because of time and not being able to add as much detail in as I'd like, this tombstone inscription that you're looking at is only about half of the tombstone. And Samuel had a second wife. Guess what her name was? Margaret. And so if you didn't have this tombstone inscription and the full details from it, you would miss some critical information about Samuel and his family, and you could start down the wrong path with some of the research that you would do. Now, probate records are one of my favorite resources, especially for Wales, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a minute, but they are available online for the pre-1858 time period and the post-1858 time period. So in 1858, there was a change. Before that date, the Church of England managed all probate matters in England and Wales. After 1858, the government took that over, and the indexes are better. The information that you get to help lead you to those probate records can be a little bit better in many cases. With Wales, we have probate abstracts that really help simplify things and will help with additional searches that you can do. So I mentioned that the pre-1858 probate records are available on the National Library of Wales website. Yeah, it's fairly easy. Just go to their main page and do a search for the name of your ancestor. This is a specific spelling search. So if I had 2 L's on Howell's first name, it wouldn't find it. So you will have to play around with this a little bit, but it is pretty easy to find what you're looking for. You do have to have the parish name spelled with their standard spelling, and that's easy enough to find. They use the Welsh Administrative and Territorial Units Gazetteer as the standard spelling, and it's the same that the Family History Library catalog uses. So you can do that to find out how you should be spelling the place name. When you get your search results back, in this case, there was only one, and even with more common names, there are ways to adjust your searches so that you don't get a great big huge long list, and I'll be able to show you more of that when we meet at British Institute. So I'm looking for Howell Llewellyn. He's my great-grandfather's grandfather. And what you've got here is an example of the actual will in the nasty old handwriting and the probate abstract. So I'll ask you, which would you prefer to start with? It's not a trick question. In my opinion, this is the best way to start. Now, they're a little bit harder to get to and page through right now. The online indexes aren't there, but there are indexes in the Browse Record Collection that make it really valuable to go in and search these. They have a testator's index, they have a place name index, and they also have an index to people mentioned in the wills. And this is where the value of probate records really is huge. About 10% of the people left a will. And a lot of times people think, well, my ancestor was poor and wouldn't have had a will. I've seen laborers that had wills, not infrequently. So it's a situation that you need to check for your family, you need to check for your ancestor, but more importantly, with these probate abstracts, you can find out who was mentioned in the wills very easily. And by my estimate, about 40% of the people were mentioned in the wills. So that means you've got about a 40% chance of finding your ancestor or your relatives mentioned in somebody's will. Maybe not their relative, but maybe a neighbor or employer. And so that gives you a lot of possibility for fleshing out your own family tree. So one of the things that I have in the past few years started trying to incorporate with my classes is strategies that you can use in your research problem. If in a perfect world, as an instructor, I would know what you're trying to do. I would have information about your ancestors, the problem you're working on, and be able to help you directly with that. But most of the time we can't do that as we teach a class. So I want to give you strategies that you can use and reuse and reuse. So a real simple one to start with to think about is always look for people in records where you're going to see extra relationships identified. So the census is a perfect example. Monumental inscriptions are a good source for that, because you usually get about 3 people mentioned on a tombstone with relationships. Probate records are phenomenal, like that probate abstract just illustrated. So there's a lot that you can do with records that have multiple people and relationships mentioned. Next step is to always look for the marriages, starting out with a search for the marriage of couple rather than the christening of their kids can provide extra information. And more importantly, when you're working with common names like Evans and Jones and Williams, when you search for a marriage, hopefully you've at least got the bride's given name. So you have 3 different names. You'd have the groom's first name, the groom's last name, the bride's first name. You would have hopefully a general area to search in and a time period. Each one of those factors will help you narrow things down. And that's a critical technique to use when you're working on common names. So that's part of the reason for these strategies. Then you want to go in and add more information that you will find from other records. And one thing that is often talked about with British family history is making sure that you're killing off your ancestor. You always want to get the death records, whether it's a burial, a death certificate, a probate record, a monumental inscription, whatever it is that you can find, you need to be looking at those because there will be critical clues in those records relating to when a person died. Now, the search order for all of these records will vary a little bit depending on the time period you're working in. So if you're working on a family that lived and died after the census, so after 1841, even if they were born in the 1700s but died after 1841, you probably should be starting with a census search. Monumental inscriptions, I've got number 2, and that's as much to make the point about the value of those as anything, but that's a valuable resource because it does link people together so well. Church and chapel records are great, but they normally only tie one or two additional people together. So when you look for an individual in church and chapel records, most of the time you don't get as many family connections included there. So that's why it's ranked a little bit lower. Civil registration is similar. It's very helpful. Probate records are fabulous, but normally you want to get extra information from the preceding choices to help you with the probate search. Now let's talk about names and patronymics a little bit. This will give you a taste, give you a little bit of information that you can utilize, and hopefully it will start to make sense. And the more you hear about it, the more you look at the records, patronymics will be a little more clear all the time. So part of the problem with patronymics is that it was a completely different naming system. And it basically, well, really, surnames didn't exist. There weren't any last names. It was just John, the son of Thomas, or John Thomas, or John Thomas Jones. Because of the common names that were used when Welsh families started adopting fixed surnames, you ended up with a small pool of surnames. And so the top 10 surnames in Wales account for over 50% of the population. So you've got a lot of people with the same name. And that's one of the drawbacks to doing Welsh family history. But at the same time, as you learn to deal with that, as you learn to work around those problems, it'll make you a whole lot better at family history research for any area that you're working in. So the basics of patronymics are that a name came from the name of the father or another ancestor. So the problem is that not everybody followed the rules as we understand them. And I have a small example of that. But basically, if you see Mab or Ab or Ab, that means son of. Verch, or spelled with a V. There's no V in the Welsh language, so that's an English insertion. That means daughter of. And in South Wales, you won't always see Ab or Ab. So I've got some examples here. Evan, Reese, Apjohn. So that's pretty clear. You can assume that that individual was using a patronymic naming system. Margaret Verch Thomas, again, very clear, that's patronymic. But what about the last two? William Morgan John, you need to consider that as a patronymic, not a middle name. That's William and his father Morgan and his grandfather John. This is where I think patronymic starts to become just a huge, huge blessing, because just in the name of a child in a christening, you can get 2 or 3 additional generations of your family tree. Now, The bottom one, David William, is that patronymic or is that a surname? Typically, if you have an S on the last name in the line, that would indicate that it's a fixed surname. So you would consider David William as still using patronymics. Now, we've got some examples here from a burial record in 1750. Not every family adopted fixed surnames at the same time. So the first one that's underlined is David William Gibbs. With the S on the end of the name, the last name there of Gibbs, you would consider the possibility that they've stopped using patronymics and they are using fixed surnames. And Gibbs is seen fairly regular at an earlier time in this locality. Jeanette, the wife of William Morgan John, her husband is using patronymics. And then the last one, Evan Reese ap John, shows with the son of, or the Welsh version of son of there. So you'll see mixed use of patronymics in the area where your ancestors lived. And one of the things you'll have to do is get familiar with that and how it operated in your locality. People switched from patronymics to fixed surnames at different times. But starting to recognize the pattern will help you and enable you to be more accurate with your research. This example shows the changeover when Matthew John William is using patronymics. His son, Thomas Matthew, it's probably patronymic, but when you see Thomas Matthew having the son Henry Matthew, then you can start to assume and expect that they've adopted fixed surnames. It doesn't have the S on the end. They didn't always take that, but in most cases they did. Now there's a pattern used, like in some other countries like Ireland and Scotland, that they would use for the naming of children in the family, and they would follow a pattern where the first son was named after the father's father, the first daughter after the mother's mother, the second son after the father's father, and the second daughter after the father's mother. In this case, they didn't completely follow the pattern, and that's what you've got to be aware of. How do you know? You use this naming pattern as a rule of thumb or a guide, but you can't expect that they followed it exactly. In this case, I've documented that David Williams was the son of William Williams, and their first child, David's first child, was named William. The second son was named Noah, so they fit the pattern. But Margaret does not fit the pattern. Margaret, born in 1850. But by knowing more about the family, we can see why they may not have followed the pattern. David's mother, Margaret Thomas, was living with him and his young family at the time of the 1851 census, and she was about 76 years old. So I imagine in 1850, when Margaret was born, that they named their first daughter after grandma, who was living with the family. Now, that's just a guess. I don't have any evidence for that, other than the fact that Margaret Thomas was living with the family in 1851. She died in 1852, and that's the way it works. You find a pattern, or you find a rule of thumb that you can follow and use as a guide, but don't hold too closely to it. Use it as a guide and then prove it out with the records that you're able to find. So the bottom line is, this is one of the best reference books for Welsh family history. Patronymics is so critical to understand that you really need to have access to this either at a local library or in your own collection. In my opinion, the map on page 56 is worth the price of the whole book. And so if you're not back to, say, 1800, 40 with your research, then maybe you won't need this yet. But some of the information about the common names that it provides would help. But if you're researching before 1800 anywhere in Wales, you need access to this book. They looked at every will, every probate record in Wales before 1858, 110,000 of them, and compiled data that will help you be more successful with your research. There's another source, the British Surname Atlas. This is a CD product based on the 1881 census, and you can do a search for any surname, and it'll show you how many there were in the country at the time, in all of England, Wales, and Scotland, and it will break it down by county, showing you the highest concentrations. Now, Jones is considered a very common Welsh name, but you'll notice the darkest counties are Glamorganshire and Lancashire. And if you look in the middle at Radnor, there's hardly any Joneses there compared to the rest of the country. So even with the really, really common names, they're not all located the same. So names like Jenkins has a totally different distribution, and tools like this are what we'll talk about at British Institute to help you solve some of the problems you're going to have with common name ancestors and Welsh family history in particular. So you run into a problem sometimes with records in Welsh, and it's not huge, in my opinion, until you start getting into more details, but these are the records where you'll typically find Welsh, where you'll encounter Welsh language. Nonconformist records aren't too bad because with a christening or a burial record, you can figure things out without understanding the language much. Chapel histories are a little more difficult, but you can pick out names and places and then work with Google Translate to get a little bit of the gist of things. Monumental inscriptions are another source that you'll frequently find in Welsh, but that's not too bad to work with. Periodicals, that's just straight Welsh, a lot of it, and there's a lot of great material there, and so that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge. So typically you'll find a tombstone inscription that looks like this. This is very common, and knowing what to do with that if you don't have any Welsh language experience can seem very overwhelming, but it's not that bad. Google Translate will give you the basics. It'll take care of months, it'll take care of some relationships, so it will help. It's not perfect. This one's actually fairly decent with the translation. I looked at one a couple of days ago, and it was about the same as this inscription, but the translation seemed a whole lot worse. But it's something that will give you a stab, or give you a chance to get a little bit of information from that without having to learn any more Welsh. Now, there's a really, really good page on the Family Search Wiki for the Welsh that you'll find on tombstone inscriptions. Makes it really easy to work through those few details that you run into. So let's talk about tactics for success. We've got to start winding things up for the webinar. Always look for your ancestor in every available census, every one. So it's just one of the standard things you need to do. Find them in every available census. Sometimes you'll find an extra piece of information, an extra relationship that you didn't in earlier or a later census. So you need to find your ancestor in every one of those. Always search both the parish registers and the bishop's transcripts when you're looking at parish records for the Church of England. And always kill off your ancestor. Find the death-related records, and you'll see that most of the time there's going to be some other relationships included that will be valuable in your research. Always Always use indexes, but don't ever trust them. There was a gentleman by the name of Hank Jones, I believe, that was a pretty prominent genealogist in the US. And in one of his lectures, he said that the best place to hide information is in an index. And we'll talk in the British Institute course in October about ways to uncover some of that information that gets buried or hidden in the indexes. And then always watch for patronymics. As soon as you see those three names in a string, that's a huge clue for you. And it's a great jump start to the rest of your family history journey. Sometimes searching by given name is a whole lot better than doing surname searches or the typical searches that we do in most of our family history research. Another thing you want to do is get very immersed in the local history. There's a lot of information available. I don't know if it's better for Wales than other areas. I like to think so, because there's so much available. And that's one of the things I wish we had more time to get into. It's one of my diversions is digging into that kind of thing. And I believe that makes me a better researcher and a better genealogist. And it really enriches the information I learn about my family and how they lived. One of the things that you should always do, and I am afraid that in the internet age we're in, we don't do enough of browsing the records page by page. When I started 30 years ago, that was the only way to do it in most cases. You looked page by page at the record set, and we don't do that very much anymore. But that's one of the ways that you can be successful on a particular family line where others have not. Now, one of the things I have been working on over the last few years is to incorporate case studies in my research classes and in the teaching that I do. And it takes more time, but I hope that it helps understand how to apply the records and the research strategies and techniques to your own particular research problem. So my great-grandfather went back to Wales, and he, while he was there, after he'd immigrated, he went back for a couple of years, and he wrote a journal. He never wrote any before or after that we're aware of, but for those 2 years, he did a pretty good job. And there's little bits and pieces buried in there. And in September, he visited his mother's cousin, Evan Evans, superintendent of police. And that doesn't give us much to work with. And as you know, Evan Evans is as common as it gets. So what I did is I started by looking at the census records. And one of the things I'd like you to note is the way I've got this chart laid out. This is a drop line pedigree, and it helps me see the wider family in context. And this is a technique that I use to get the broader picture and visualize things better so that I can solve problems better. And in this case, the way I work these is I list the record. I try to use a different color of pen or pencil so that I can see the difference that the different records provide, the different information items. And so I knew my great-grandfather had visited his mother's cousin, Evan Evans. He was a policeman in Neath, Wales. So that was 1889. First thing I did is I went to the 1891 census. I found him and his wife, not with her maiden name, but they had one child still living at home, Gwenllian. And in the 1881 census, I found additional kids. They were still in Neath. And from there, I jumped to birth certificates. Now, the first three kids, their names are too common to make it very easy to find a birth certificate for them. There's a technique that or a little twist that you can apply in the research that would make it so you could find the right birth certificates. And that's the sort of thing we'll deal with at British Institute. But I went looking at the GRO index for Gwenllian Evans' birth and was able to get one that matched up fairly easy, not a lot of time involved there. But it was the combination of the census records and then the birth indexes, and I was able to get that information. Once I had Gwenllian's birth certificate, I had the mother's maiden name, and then I could go search for the birth for Mary, William, and Margaret and get those documented. And then we go to the next page, and this is near the end of the research on this family, and it shows additional record types. So number 4, after I got the birth certificates and had verified the mother's maiden name, I got the marriage certificate for Evan Evans and Hannah Walters. With that, I got their father's names, and that provided me a little bit more information. It's not what I was specifically after, but it was additional that helps play into things later. Again, going back to my suggestion on the tactic of getting the marriage. And once I had that, had a little bit more place name information and locality information, then I found the family in the 1851 census. So I go back to the census, and then number 6, I started killing people off. And the monumental inscription for Gurid Chapel, Nonconformist Chapel, tied some of the family members together. Evan's mother and father and one brother, I think. And then I got Margaret's death certificate. And if I remember right, I haven't noted it here on this, but if I remember right, Evan Evans was the informant on Margaret's death certificate. So it helps tie things together. And then I went back to marriages and I found the marriage record for Thomas Evans and Margaret Evans' mother, Margaret Llewellyn. With that, I went to the probate record. We look at the probate record for Hal Llewellyn, number 9. All of that in green that's the people that he mentioned. They were in that probate abstract that I showed earlier, and that helped tie Margaret Llewellyn and Thomas and their family together. And then the history, a small local history of a Gurid. We'll go look at those now, a couple of those sources. So this is from the probate, and this is where Hal Llewellyn mentions his daughter, Margaret David, the wife of Thomas David of Betting. So he names the farm that they were living at, and that's part of the key, is that farm name helps tie this together. And this is kind of the clincher for a lot of it, the history of the Gurid. And this was published in 1897. There are a lot of sources like this, and at British Institute, I'll try to teach you how to find some of these for the areas that you're researching in. And this specifically identifies Evan Evans, the superintendent of police at Neath, as the grandson of Howell Gathluca. And that's the common ancestor. And that's where we get to Evan Evans that my great-grandfather visited. And this is actually a picture of him that I was able to locate. So that's the kind of thing that I want to pull in here and there during British Institute, is how to find some of these little treasures that are buried all over the place, online and offline, that'll help you learn more about your family, like I've done with Evan Evans and Noah Williams. So Evan was raised at Betting Farm in Llangiug. He was the grandson of Howell Gathluca, and he raised his family and died in Neath. So now I started out with almost cryptic entry in my great-grandfather's diary about meeting his mother's cousin. Now I know how those two are related, and I've been able to document that. And it's employing the techniques, the strategies, and utilizing a variety of record types, a wider variety of record types than might be done with a lot of families in other parts of the world. And it's doable, even with a common name like Evan Evans. And that's the end of my slides.
And your Winternet hung on until the end.
Yeah.
Super. Okay, I am going to see if there's any questions. So somebody is raising their hand. If you could please just type your question in the chat box instead. I am not able to unmute your mic so you can ask the question. So it really does have to be through typing. So this is from way back. Christina is asking, is there a list of the 56 excluded? Not sure what the 56 is referring to.
56 parishes
Yes.
originally requested that their records not be included in the digitization project that Family Search, National Library of Wales, and Find My Past worked on. There is a list of those in the Family Search wiki. And there's also a list, the same list includes other records that have been found to be missing. And so that wiki article tries to document missing things that you may have to go to the actual microfilm version of that was recorded, captured back in the 1950s, I believe. So there are some other options, and some of that will be noted in that Family Search wiki article.
Super. Is there a good source for migration patterns from Wales into England in the 18th century?
There are different sources, different resources for migration. There's not a real good record before the 1851 census that would get very specific, but there are phenomenal sources. They're scattered, and that's part of the problem. So knowing more about the time period, the occupation of the people that you're looking for, things like that could definitely help point to maybe a specific record. Poor law records for the pre-1834 time period can be really helpful with that, but it's not arranged in a way that you can just go and see who moved to England or who in England came from Wales. You have to get a little more specific than that, but poor law records can be a substitute for migration records of that earlier time period. And I've found others. Recently, I've been using some court records and found details about migration in the mid 1600s. So again, the whole concept of the Institute in October on hidden treasures in Welsh family history, there are so many things to help answer a question like that, but we really have to have more details to be able to answer it. But in general, if it's before 1834, I'd say poor law records might be a good starting point.
Good. And thank you for that. That seems to be all of the questions that we have. So thank you again for your time, Darris, and for sharing your knowledge with us. And people who are interested in registering for Darris's course, registration for the British Institute is open. You can find the information on our new website, isbgfh.com, and sign up there and learn some more about the hidden gems in Welsh family history from Darris in Salt Lake City in October. Thanks so much, Darris.
Thank you.